Hi everyone, this is Catherine Love. This is my lesson plan for Module 6. Once again, I am a special education teacher at Soap Creek Elementary in Cobb County, and I teach 5th graders with a general education teacher. And for this lesson, I created a 5-day ELA lesson that was broken down into multiple parts to first start off with parts of speech, has a review, prepping for milestones, but really the bulk of this was to learn about the form and use of perfect verb tenses and recognizing the shift in verb tenses. And then we wrapped up this lesson with correlative conjunctions. For ISTE standards, we applied the empowered learner, digital privacy, knowledge constructor, creative communicator, and global collaborator. So we began with a pre-made Canva presentation as just for a review of the parts of speech. It was very simple, very clear. Since students, it's always good to review, but we just went through it and it was basic. It was a quick, easy, everything we reviewed here should have been a complete review. It was quick for students to recall, but this just kind of sparked what they were getting ready to do. So then we moved into the digital tool called Lumio. And if you've never used Lumio before, I highly recommend it. So when you use Lumio, it is like gamification with PowerPoints and interactive instruction, Nearpod-esque all in one. So when you have a Lumio lesson, this is kind of what would happen, kind of like Kahoot, Nearpod. You have either QR code or the lumioclass.com, and you enter a class ID. And you go through what would be slides. So this was our verb tense and aspect slide. And we went through, and everything that's on my screen is also on the student screen. So students can manipulate it. If you want to turn that on and off, you can. But if I wanted to use the highlighter, I could just highlight it, and it would highlight onto students' computers as well. And we would move on to the next slides. We went through all of this, and then we had a game. And so we had a game show start, and this was first for individual student practice. Every student could do this on their own. They'd spin it, and they're just basically competing against themselves. And they would answer a question based on the verb tense as followed. And then we moved on to more perfect tense practice. And then we had a flip out, which we turned into first just a review. They just flipped it. That was their own practice, basically match game. And then we did speed up. This was a lot of fun. This is where you could split your class into teams and they compete against each other. Of course, I don't have any students right now, so it would just be myself, and they are timed, and it is so much fun. We would play this several times just to continue that practice. And then we moved into more shifting of verb tense. We did another team quiz for the class. That was so much fun. And they don't know who, and that would be re-logging it if needed. But that's why it came up because no students are joined, but I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun. And then we moved into correlative conjunctions. But before we did that, we then moved to a printable, and where students had to rewrite the story, and they could have the Lumio up and go back to slides when we opened it for students to use, and they were editing stories and finding where the incorrect verb tense usage was, and then they would check it and move on. So we go back to the Lumio, we went on to correlative conjunctions. This was probably about Wednesday, Thursday. And then we had similar games. It was beneficial for students to do a game that they already had practiced with, which some of these we already have used before, but this was really great for students. So we stopped with the Lumio for the correlative conjunctions and then went to our other digital resource, which was Nearpod. Very similar, get a code, and we did a whole group and then self-paced correlative conjunctions Nearpod. We went through it to talk about it, but it was just nice to, as a class, do a little more together. They had discussion questions. We had slides to continue just to refresh our memory. And then we did a lot of practice together. We read these aloud. Again, whatever was on my screen could be on their screen. And then it was this sort of activity. They could see myself draw, or if I had a student go up to the board, use the touchpad and draw on their own. So to wrap up this week-long lesson, we at first gave them time to practice using a Canva practice quiz. It started off with just revisiting those parts of speech which we had been learning for the past few weeks, especially leading up to milestones. And then it moved into perfect present tense, past tense, and then into correlative conjunctions. And if they felt that they were doing well with this Canva activity, then they could move on to the forms, which we did in Microsoft Forms with our last Microsoft or digital learning tool. I highly recommend Forms. I know it's a lot of work to initially type all your pre-made work into a Forms, but it's so nice, and it is teaching skills, getting them ready for that middle high school level. And we taught or use this as a more formative based assessment. And then after a while, if students need to retest, we could, but that is all. And at the conclusion of this, we loved this lesson. It was a lot of terminology and critical thinking skills for students. However, it was so beneficial. They loved the Lumio. Any sort of competition-based or game, they really enjoyed. So if you need recommendations for Lumio, I have a few that I can share with you, but thanks for listening.